screen. We'll go straight now to our first question. It's from in the audience, and it's from Michael Cohen.
The 1760s American Revolution focused on the concept of no taxation without representation, which provided a situation where the government implemented tax without the consent of its citizens. Is the carbon tax not a product of this notion, as the Australian public voted on a government who said they would never introduce a carbon tax?
Greg Combet, let's start with you, and you can take a lead from Craig Emerson if you like and sing your answer.
Go on. I'll spare everyone that, thanks. Look, I understand it's a very difficult issue in this debate for people, but we have to return to some basic principles, I think, in addressing it. One is that the scientists are telling us that greenhouse gas emissions are causing climate change. And when governments accept that advice, they have a responsibility to deal with it by putting in place policy measures that will reduce greenhouse gas emissions in partnership with other nations. In the 2007 election, both John Howard and Kevin Rudd, representing the Labor Party at that time, took a policy of that nature to the election. And in fact, in that last term of Parliament, of course, Kevin Rudd's government reached agreement with Malcolm Turnbull to legislate pretty much identically what started from July the 1st, what started yesterday, the government's carbon pricing scheme.
It's identical except for the carbon tax.
It's pretty close to it. Kevin Rudd's scheme had a fixed price at the start of it as well, but it's an emissions trading scheme that starts with a fixed price. I know it's a very controversial issue. I know that the circumstances of the last election have heightened the controversy, but at the end of the day, there's a public policy responsibility to deal with as a very important issue for future generations.
Sophie, Mirabella.
Well, the problem is that we need to separate the science from the policy. And the Coalition accepts that we need to do something about emissions, but it's the policy that is the problem. Prime Minister went to the last election saying there would be no carbon tax, and now we have Greg Combet, the Prime Minister, saying this is a very important issue, we've got to act for our generation. The reality is this was a political fix to ensure that the Prime Minister guaranteed the support of the Greens.
Didn't your sort of politics invent the core and non-core promise?
We went to the election. The Prime Minister went to the election, and the Treasurer, Wayne Swan, said we were hysterical for saying there would be a carbon tax under this government. Let's separate the actual science and what we agree on, and let's find out the best possible policy, because the carbon tax is a dud. People know our emissions will still continue to go up. People know that the government will waste $3.5 billion of taxpayers' money a year buying carbon permits, and they know that by making manufacturing uncompetitive in Australia, we will push jobs and manufacturing offshore to countries who will make the same stuff we used to make but create more emissions in doing so. So it's bad for the environment because emissions will go up, and it's bad for jobs, and it is just a very bad political fix because Julia Gillard had the poor political judgment to think that she needed to give the Greens the carbon tax in order to stay in office. You can't say we're leading the way.
I'm going to ask you to wind up because there are other people on the panel.
Sure. I mean, we hear the Labor Party say, oh, we're leading the world, and then on the other side, the Prime Minister says, oh, I've got to work with the Parliament that I've got. Well, which one is it? You either were pushed into it by the Greens, which she was, or you're supposedly leading the way in the world's biggest carbon tax that no one wants to follow. You can't be a leader if no one wants to follow you.
Okay, Simon Sheikh, the questioner took us back to 1770, the American Revolution.
He did.
Making the analogy with the tax and no taxation without representation.
He did, and I sense, Michael, to go back to your question, some scepticism perhaps about why we're doing this in the first place. I would imagine that one thing that you and I can agree on, Michael, is that we want to leave this world in a better place than when we found it. And that's what's at the core of this argument. It might sound a bit naff, but it's what's at the core of this argument. The scary thing is that where past generations have made sacrifices for their children's future, we are at risk right now of being the first generation in human history to make sacrifices, to make sacrifices for... Sorry, I'm getting this all wrong, aren't I? We're at risk of being the first generation to sacrifice our children for our own present. And that to me is very scary. I mean, I'm really scared by that proposition. The carbon price, it's such a shame that whenever we talk about it, we end up going through the argy-bargy of the politics, because I think we should rise above that. I mean, right now, today, we've joined 850 million people around the world who are living under a carbon price. More people in China live under a carbon price than here in Australia. So it's time that we get past the great big scare campaign and actually start talking about why we're taking action in the first place.
Grahame Morris. Grahame Morris.
I don't think we should forget why we're doing this. The Prime Minister and the Minister sort of don't talk about why we're doing this much anymore. Remember, you know, in the John Howard period, there was a dirty, great big drought, and that log Al Gore was running around the world saying the sky was going to fall in, which is probably a bit unfair to logs. Logs are useful. And everyone panicked a bit, and then the rest of the world went to Copenhagen and said, we're going to fix this. We're going to do something about it. And Australia said, oh, well, if you go, we will. And then the rest of the world went to Copenhagen and they didn't fix it. They didn't agree. And here we are, stuck with this mongrel tax that every mum and dad is going to pay. And we've got our grandparents and kids and families are all going to pay a squillion for their heating this winter. And China, America, the Indians and whatnot are laughing at us. And we're screwing up our own businesses overseas that can't compete, just so that you know, the Minister and the PM can make the Greens feel happy and stay in office. It is a crook tax.
Lenore Taylor, you can respond to that. Lenore Taylor, first of all.
I think going back to Michael's question, clearly the government made a hash of its policy in the last election, and I think they've made a bit of a hash of selling their policy since then. But what you might not get from the political debate, from listening to Sophie and to Grahame, is that there's something else the main parties agree on as well. Besides the science of global warming, they actually agree on what our share of the global task of emissions reduction is. They agree on, when you look at the whole task that the globe has, what we should do, and that is a 5% emissions reduction. What they disagree on is the means of getting there. So there's a lot of debate about, oh, it makes no difference, or the international community isn't acting, but in fact, both sides of Parliament agree that the international community is acting sufficiently for us to cut our emissions by about 152 million tonnes a year in 2020. They disagree on the means to get there, and I think it would be really good if we got the policy debate back on the two plans to get to that aim, rather than mixing it up like it's being mixed up by everybody participating.
Okay.